The cameras arrived on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesday is the day I bake. It has been the day I bake for nearly 40 years. Ever since my mother taught me that a house without the smell of something warm in the oven is just a building with furniture. That morning I had made a peach cobbler, the kind with a buttery crust that bubbles up golden at the edges, the kind my son Daniel used to press his small face against the oven glass to watch when he was 7 years old. The kind he never once mentioned anymore. The box sat on my front porch in Memphis, Tennessee, in the kind of late September heat that doesn't know it's supposed to be autumn yet. Picked it up myself, both hands. Carried it inside without asking anyone for help. That's important to understand about me. I have never been the kind of woman who waits to be carried. My name is Dorothy Ellen Marsh. I am 71 years old. I have lived in this house on Cloverfield Lane for 33 years. I raised 2 children here. I buried a husband here. Not literally, of course, but the grief of losing Raymond to a heart attack 8 years ago settled into the walls of this place the way grief does, quiet and permanent, like the smell of old wood after rain. I ordered the cameras myself. 4 of them. Small, white, unobtrusive. The kind you can check from your phone. My neighbor Carol had mentioned them 6 months ago. Said she'd installed them after a package went missing from her porch. I had smiled and nodded and thought I would never need something like that. I trusted the people in my life. I want to be honest with you about why I changed my mind. It wasn't one thing. It was never one thing. It was the accumulation of small moments that a woman tries to explain away. The way you try to explain away a water stain on the ceiling, telling yourself it's old, it's nothing, until the morning you wake up and the whole corner is soft and dark and everything you ignored has become impossible to ignore. Daniel and his wife Melissa had moved in with me in March of 2025. That was how they presented it, moved in with me. As though they were guests in my space, in my life. I had agreed because Daniel said they were having financial trouble, that the rent on their apartment in Nashville had become unmanageable, that they needed 6 months, maybe 8, to save enough to get back on their feet. He sat across from me at this very kitchen table, and he looked tired in a way that reminded me of his father, that hollow-eyed exhaustion Raymond used to carry home from long weeks at the warehouse, and I felt my heart open the way it always does for my children, wide and without condition. Of course, I told him. This is your home too. Meant it. I have always meant the things I say. My daughter Linda lives in Phoenix with her husband Greg and my 2 grandchildren, Avery and Cole. She called me the week before Daniel moved in, and I remember the particular tone she used. Careful, the way you are careful around something fragile. Mama, she said, just make sure you know what you're agreeing to. I told her she was being uncharitable. I told her Daniel was going through a hard time and family shows up for hard times. She went quiet in the way Linda goes quiet when she disagrees but has decided not to fight. I should have listened more carefully to that silence. Linda has always been the one who sees things clearly. I have always been the one who chooses to see things kindly instead. By September 6 months had passed. Daniel and Melissa were still here. There had been no talk of leaving, no mention of savings, no update on any plan. The cobbler I made that Tuesday sat cooling on the counter, and when Melissa came downstairs at 11 in the morning, still in her robe, she walked past it without a word, opened the refrigerator, stared into it for a long moment and said, "There's nothing to eat in this house." I stood at the sink with my hands in warm soapy water, and I did not say a word. That was the moment I decided to install the cameras. I want you to understand something about the kind of woman I am before I go any further. I am not suspicious by nature. I am not the kind of mother who reads diaries or listens at doors or checks phone screens when they're left face up on the table. Raymond used to say I had too much faith in people, that I gave trust like it was something that grew back on its own, like it was a garden plant and not something precious and finite. I used to laugh at that. I used to think he was the cynical one and I was simply realistic about the goodness in people. Raymond was right. He was right about a lot of things I only understand now that he isn't here to hear me admit it. I installed the cameras on a Wednesday, the day after the box arrived. I watched 3 tutorial videos on my iPad the night before, sitting up in bed with my reading glasses on, taking notes on the back of an envelope the way I used to take notes in church. I wrote down each step in my careful, looping handwriting. I was not going to ask Daniel to help me. I understood even then that whatever I was about to learn was something I needed to learn alone. The first camera went in the living room, angled toward the front door. The second went in the kitchen, up high near the cabinet above the refrigerator, pointed toward the counter and the table. The third I placed in the hallway outside my bedroom door. The fourth I put in the garage where Raymond's old work table still stands, where I keep the filing cabinet with all our important papers. The deed to the house, the insurance documents, Raymond's pension records, my own financial files, everything that matters in the language of grown adult life. I placed that fourth camera very deliberately. 3 days before, I had gone to the garage to find the folder where I keep my utility receipts. I like to track them season to season, something Raymond started and I kept up after he passed, and I noticed the filing cabinet drawer was not fully closed. I am a woman who closes drawers. Fully. Every time. It is not a habit I would ever break. Raymond used to joke that I would close a drawer in the middle of an earthquake. The drawer was open 1.25 inches. I stood in the garage in the thin morning light and I stared at it and I told myself there was an explanation. I told myself this the way you tell yourself something when part of you already knows the truth but the rest of you isn't ready to hold it yet. Checked the files. Everything appeared to be in place. I closed the drawer and went back inside and made breakfast and did not mention it to anyone. But I ordered the cameras that afternoon. By Thursday the system was running. The app on my phone was clean and simple. A grid of 4 small squares, each one a live window into a corner of my own home. I sat in my bedroom that first evening and looked at those 4 squares and felt something I struggle to name even now. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't relief. It was closer to grief, I think. The grief of a woman who has had to install eyes in her own house because the people she loves have made her feel like a stranger inside it. Daniel and Melissa had a rhythm I had slowly come to understand over those 6 months. They slept late, rarely downstairs before 10, sometimes closer to noon. They kept to themselves mostly. Meals were a loose, uncoordinated thing. Melissa cooked occasionally, elaborate dishes that used every pan I owned and left the kitchen in a state that took me an hour to restore. Daniel sometimes ordered delivery, the bags left on the counter until I cleared them. They watched television in the living room until late into the night, loud enough that I could hear it through my bedroom floor, a low vibration that moved through the house like a second heartbeat that wasn't mine. I adapted. I adjusted my schedule, my sleep, my routines. I moved through my own home carefully, the way you move through a space that belongs to someone else. That Thursday evening I sat on the edge of my bed and watched the kitchen camera feed, and I saw Melissa standing at my counter, going through my mail. Not her mail. The stack I keep near the fruit bowl, held together with a rubber band. She wasn't opening anything. She was just looking. Flipping through each envelope slowly, reading the return addresses, pausing on 2 or 3 of them before setting them back down. I watched her do this for 4 minutes and 20 seconds. I know the exact time because the app records everything with a timestamp. Then she put the stack back, went to the refrigerator, poured herself a glass of juice, and walked back upstairs without a sound. I sat with my phone in my hands for a long time after that. I did not sleep well that night. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being unseen by the people who are supposed to know you best. I had lived alone for 8 years after Raymond passed, and in all that time, through all those quiet evenings and empty Sundays and holidays I navigated by myself, I never felt as lonely as I did that October, living in a full house. Kept watching the cameras. I want to be honest about that. I did not install them and then step away and wait for something dramatic to unfold. I watched them the way you watch a wound you're not sure is healing. Carefully, consistently, with a kind of dread sitting just beneath your ribs that you try not to name out loud. Most of what I saw was ordinary. Melissa on her phone at the kitchen table for hours at a stretch, coffee going cold beside her. Daniel coming downstairs in the afternoon, standing in front of the open refrigerator for long minutes the way men do, as though the food will rearrange itself into something more interesting if he waits long enough. They talk to each other in the low, half-finished sentences of people who have been together long enough that full thoughts feel unnecessary. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes the laughter sounded easy and genuine, and I would feel something soften in me, some small warmth, and I would think, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm reading shadows. But then there were the other moments. The first one that truly settled into my chest happened on a Sunday morning in early October. I was at church. I sing in the choir at Calvary Baptist, have for 22 years, and those Sunday mornings are mine in a way that nothing else is anymore. I was gone for 3 hours. When I came home, I went to the app before I even took off my coat, the way I had started doing without fully acknowledging that I had started doing it. I rewound the kitchen footage. 20 minutes after I left, Daniel came downstairs. He made coffee. Then Melissa joined him and they sat at my kitchen table and they talked. The cameras don't record sound, I want to be clear about that. I chose the model I chose deliberately because I was not trying to surveil my family, I was trying to understand something. So I watched their mouths move and their faces shift, and I read what I could in the body language of two people who believed they were completely unwatched. At one point, Daniel picked up one of the envelopes from my mail stack, the same stack Melissa had gone through days earlier, and held it up. Melissa leaned forward. He said something and she nodded slowly, her expression focused in a way I had not seen before. He put the envelope back, but he had looked at it for a long time. The envelope was from my bank. I sat in my coat in the front hallway and I felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the October air. I called Linda that evening. Not to tell her what I had seen. I wasn't ready for that yet. But just to hear her voice, to tether myself to something solid. She answered on the second ring, the way Linda always does, and I could hear Avery and Cole somewhere in the background, the bright, ordinary chaos of a household with children, and I felt a sharp ache for it. "How are things, Mama?" she asked. "Fine," I said. "Just wanted to hear your voice." She paused the way she pauses. "You sure?" "I made peach cobbler this week," I said. "Thought of you." We talked for 40 minutes about nothing important. The kids' school, Greg's new job, the weather in Phoenix, the weather in Memphis. I did not mention Daniel. I did not mention the envelope. I did not mention the cameras. But when we hung up, I sat in my bedroom and I let myself feel, just for a few minutes, the full weight of what was happening in my own home. Raymond and I had sacrificed for these children in the way that parents sacrifice. Invisibly, constantly, without keeping score. We had gone without so they could have. I had worked 26 years as an administrative coordinator at a medical group downtown, steady and reliable, building the kind of financial security that doesn't come from luck but from discipline and patience and saying no to yourself for decades so that later you can say yes to the people you love. We had paid off this house. Raymond's life insurance and pension had been carefully managed. I was not a wealthy woman, but I was a stable one. I had worked very hard to be a stable one. And now I was watching my son hold my bank statements in the kitchen I had owned for 33 years. I opened the app again. Garage camera. Filing cabinet. Closed, undisturbed, exactly as I had left it. I exhaled slowly. Then I picked up my phone and called my attorney. Her name is Patricia Owens, and she has been my attorney for 16 years. Raymond found her first. He needed someone to help with his will, back when his health started showing the first quiet warning signs that we both pretended weren't warnings at all. Patricia was sharp and direct and completely uninterested in telling you what you wanted to hear, which was exactly the kind of person Raymond respected. After he passed, she helped me through the estate process, through the paperwork and the accounts and the particular exhaustion of turning a shared life into a single one. I trusted her the way I trusted very few people. I called her on a Monday morning, early, before Daniel and Melissa were stirring. I sat in my car in the garage with the door closed and spoke quietly, which felt strange and also felt necessary. "Dorothy," she said, after I had explained the situation in careful, measured terms. Tell me exactly what you've seen. So I did. Mail. The bank envelope. The open filing cabinet drawer. The way Melissa had gone through my correspondence like it was something she had a right to. The way Daniel had looked at that envelope with an expression I couldn't fully read but couldn't stop thinking about. The 6 months that had stretched silently past the agreed-upon timeline with no conversation, no plan, no acknowledgement. Patricia listened without interrupting. That is one of the things I value most about her. Have you looked at your accounts recently? She asked when I finished. I check them every 2 weeks, I said. Nothing unusual so far. Keep checking, she said. Every few days now. And Dorothy, I want you to come in this week. There are some things we should update regardless, but given what you're telling me, sooner is better. I went in on Wednesday. I told Daniel I had a doctor's appointment, which was not entirely untrue. I did have a follow-up scheduled for the following week. I drove downtown to Patricia's office on Madison Avenue, took the elevator to the 4th floor, and sat across from her desk the way I had sat across from it during some of the hardest moments of my adult life. There is a small framed print on her wall, a quote I have read a dozen times. The most common form of despair is not being who you are. I had never fully understood it until that morning. We spent 2 hours together. We reviewed my will, which had not been formally updated since Raymond passed. We discussed my accounts, the checking, the savings, the modest investment portfolio my financial advisor Marcus had helped me build over the years. We talked about the deed to the house. You said Daniel's name isn't on anything? Patricia asked, not for the first time. No, I said. Raymond and I made a decision years ago. The house is mine outright. Always has been. She nodded and wrote something on her legal pad. Let's make sure it stays that way. I want to recommend we set up some additional protections. Nothing dramatic, just sensible. Given the circumstances. She used the word circumstances carefully, the way attorneys use words, and I appreciated it. She was not asking me to declare my son an enemy. She was asking me to be a woman who protects what she has built. I signed several documents that afternoon. He updated my will. I added a specific clause Patricia recommended regarding property. I also, at her suggestion, contacted Marcus at the financial firm and asked him to add a secondary verification requirement to my accounts. Nothing could be changed, transferred, or accessed without a phone confirmation directly to me. Marcus didn't ask many questions. He was efficient and kind, the way professionals are when they understand without being told that something private is happening. I drove home in the thin October sunlight feeling something I hadn't expected to feel. Not relief exactly. Not sadness. Something steadier than both. The particular quiet confidence of a woman who has begun to take care of herself. When I walked through the front door, the smell of something cooking met me. Melissa was in the kitchen making pasta, and she looked up and gave me the bright, slightly performative smile she used when she wanted to seem domestic. How was the doctor? She asked. Fine, I said. Everything is just fine. I set my purse down on the hallway table, smoothed my jacket, and walked to my bedroom to change clothes. That evening I sat in my reading chair by the window and I opened my banking app and I looked at every account, every transaction, every balance, with the careful attention of a woman who now understood what she was looking at. Everything was in order. But I kept watching. November came in quietly, the way November does in Memphis. Not with dramatic cold but with a slow dimming, the light going gray and thin, the trees releasing their leaves without ceremony. I have always loved this house most in autumn. The way the afternoon light comes through the living room windows at a low angle and turns everything amber. The way the radiator clicks and settles in the evenings like an old house clearing its throat. 33 years of Novembers in these rooms, and I still noticed the light. I was noticing everything more carefully now. It was the second week of November when I saw the thing that changed the temperature of all of it. I had been sleeping lightly, lighter than usual, which was saying something, because I had not slept deeply since March. I woke at 2:30 in the morning and lay still for a moment in the dark, listening to the house. There was movement downstairs. Soft, deliberate movement, the kind that is trying not to be heard. I picked up my phone from the nightstand and opened the app. The hallway camera showed nothing. The living room camera showed the room empty, the television dark. I switched to the kitchen camera. Daniel was standing at the counter. It was 2:34 in the morning and my son was standing in my kitchen in the dark, lit only by the screen of his phone, and he was photographing my mail. Not reading it. Photographing it. Holding each envelope up to his phone light, taking a picture, setting it down, moving to the next one. Methodical. Practiced. Like someone who had done this before or had thought carefully about how to do it. I watched him photograph 6 pieces of mail. Then he straightened the stack exactly as he had found it, turned off his phone screen, and walked back upstairs in the dark. I lay in my bed for a long time afterward. I want to tell you what that moment felt like because I think it matters. I think the feeling of it matters more than the fact of it. There was no explosion of emotion inside me. No tears, no rage, no shattering. What I felt was quieter and in some ways more devastating than any of those things. It was the feeling of a door closing. Not slamming, closing. The soft, final click of something that had been open for a very long time sealing itself shut. I thought about Daniel at 7 years old, pressing his face against the oven glass to watch the cobbler bubble. I thought about the way he used to reach for my hand in church without thinking about it, just automatically because my hand was there and he was small and the world was large. I thought about the night Raymond died, how Daniel had driven 4 hours from Nashville in the rain and walked through this front door and didn't say a single word, just put his arms around me and stood there, and I had thought, this is what I raised. This is the good thing I made. I held those memories the way you hold something you know you're about to have to set down. In the morning I called Patricia before breakfast. I forwarded her the time-stamped video clip from the app, the camera footage of Daniel photographing my mail at 2:34 in the morning. My hands were steady when I did it. I noticed that about myself. My hands were completely steady. "Dorothy," Patricia said, and her voice had shifted into the register she used when things became serious. "This is important documentation. I want you to save everything. Every clip. Date and time. Don't delete anything." "I know," I said. "Do you have any sense of what he might be looking for?" I thought about the bank envelope. I thought about the open filing cabinet drawer. I thought about Melissa going through my mail with her careful, unhurried hands. "I think," I said slowly, "that they are trying to understand what I have." The line was quiet for a moment. "Then let's make sure that what you have is protected," Patricia said. That afternoon I drove to the bank in person. I sat down with a branch manager named Mr. Ellison, a careful, soft-spoken man who treated me with a particular courtesy people sometimes reserve for elderly women, and that I normally find faintly condescending, but that day simply felt kind. I made several changes to my accounts. I won't detail all of them here, but I will say that by the time I left the bank, the financial architecture of my life had been quietly and completely restructured in ways that would not be visible from the outside but would be absolutely impenetrable from within. I stopped at the grocery store on the way home. I bought peaches, though they were out of season and not very good. I bought them anyway. Some habits are worth keeping. There is something clarifying about deciding to be quiet on purpose. Not the quiet of someone who has nothing to say, but the quiet of someone who has chosen, deliberately and with full understanding, to say nothing yet. I had always been a talker. Raymond used to say I could find conversation in an empty room, but that November I discovered a stillness in myself I hadn't known was there. I moved through my days with a kind of calm that surprised even me. I cooked. I went to choir practice. I tended the small garden bed along the south side of the house where I grow herbs even in winter. Just rosemary and thyme, things that don't mind the cold. I watched the cameras every morning with my first cup of coffee, the way another woman might read the newspaper. Daniel and Melissa had settled into a new rhythm that I observed with careful attention. Melissa had begun, subtly, to position herself differently in the house. Small things. She rearranged the items on the kitchen counter, moved my ceramic utensil holder to the far end, put her own things in the center. She replaced the hand soap at the kitchen sink with a brand she preferred without mentioning it. She began referring to the guest room where they slept as our room in conversations, a shift in language so small that in another life I might not have noticed it. I noticed it. Daniel had become attentive to me in a way that felt new and therefore felt wrong. He started coming downstairs in the mornings, closer to 9 now instead of noon, and he would pour himself coffee and ask how I had slept and whether I needed anything from the store. He fixed the loose hinge on the back door that had been bothering me for months, without my asking. He complimented my cooking with a warmth that might have moved me 6 months earlier. I accepted all of it graciously, said thank you. I smiled the way I have always smiled. I gave nothing away. Because here is what I understood by then. What those weeks of watching had taught me in the patient, unglamorous way that real knowledge tends to arrive. Daniel and Melissa were not acting out of cruelty. I want to be precise about this because I think precision matters when you're talking about people you love. They were acting out of something more ordinary and in some ways more sad than cruelty. They were acting out of entitlement, the slow, unexamined assumption that had grown in the comfortable soil of my generosity over years and years. The assumption that what was mine was eventually going to be theirs, and that the timeline of that transition was something they had a right to manage. They were not monsters. They were people who had looked at a generous woman and confused her generosity for an open door. I called Linda on a Thursday evening in mid-November. This time I told her. Not everything, not yet, but enough. I told her about the mail. About the late night in the kitchen. About the cameras. I heard her breath change on the other end of the line. "Mama," she said, and there was a weight in that single word that I felt in my chest. "I'm all right," I said immediately, because I knew that was what she needed to hear first. "Have you talked to Daniel?" "Not yet." "Are you going to?" "When I'm ready," I said. "When everything is in order." Linda was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean, everything in order?" "It means what it means," I said gently. "I need you to trust me, sweetheart." Another silence. Then, "Do you want me to come?" Thought about that. About Linda getting on a plane from Phoenix, arriving at this house with her clear eyes and her careful love, and what that would do to the particular stillness I had built around myself like a necessary shell. "Not yet," I said. "Soon." After we hung up, I sat in my reading chair and I thought about Raymond. I thought about the conversation we had the year before he died, sitting on the back porch on a warm evening, the kind of evening that feels like a gift, and he had looked at me and said, unprompted, "Dorothy, promise me you'll fight for yourself when I'm gone. You fight for everybody else. Promise me you'll fight for you." I had told him not to talk like that. I understood now that he had known something I hadn't been ready to know. I opened my laptop and began composing a document. Not a letter, not yet, but a careful, organized record of everything I had observed since March. Descriptions. Attached video clips. I wrote it the way I used to write administrative reports at work. Methodically, without emotion, letting the facts carry the weight. Took me 3 evenings to complete it. When I was done, I sent a copy to Patricia and saved 2 additional copies in places I will not describe here. Then I closed the laptop and went to bed and slept, for the first time in months without waking. December arrived and with it the particular pressure of the holidays, that annual tightening of expectation that families feel whether they acknowledge it or not. Melissa had begun talking about Christmas, mentioning it in the casual, assuming way she mentioned most things, as though the holiday were simply going to happen around her the way weather happens. She talked about a tree, about decorations, about inviting her own parents from Knoxville for the week. She said this at the kitchen table one morning while I was washing dishes. Not asking, simply informing, The way you inform someone of a fact that has already been decided. I dried my hands on the dish towel and turned to face her. Let me think about that, I said pleasantly. Something moved across her face. A brief, unguarded flicker of surprise. She was not accustomed to me saying anything other than yes. Of course, she said, recovering quickly. No rush. But there was something in her voice that told me she had already told her parents they were coming. I thought about Christmas in this house over the years. The way Raymond would spend an entire Saturday in early December untangling lights, cursing quietly under his breath, and then stand back when they were finally on the tree with an expression of pure satisfaction. The way Daniel and Linda as children would wake at 5 in the morning and sit at the top of the stairs whispering to each other, waiting for permission to come down. The way I always made Raymond's mother's sweet potato pie alongside my own mother's recipe for pound cake. Two women's legacies meeting on the same table every year. This house had 33 Christmases living in its walls. I was not going to let this one be taken from me. I called Linda that evening and told her I wanted her to come for Christmas. Her and Greg and the children. All of them. I told her to book the flights and I would handle the rest. She went so quiet on the phone that for a moment I thought the call had dropped. "Mama," she finally said. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," I said. "It's time." What I did not tell her, what I was not ready to tell anyone yet, was that I had made a decision that week that had been building for 2 months, slowly and inevitably, the way a river builds toward a bend it has always been moving toward. I had made the decision calmly, without drama, the way I had made every important decision in my adult life. Not in a moment of anger but in a moment of absolute clarity. Daniel and Melissa needed to find somewhere else to live. I had called Patricia on Monday and told her. She had not seemed surprised. We discussed the legal dimensions. The house was mine. The arrangement had been informal. No lease had ever been signed. Patricia walked me through the proper process, the appropriate notice period, the right way to handle it that protected me completely and gave them a fair and reasonable path forward. She drafted a formal notice of termination of living arrangement, which was not an eviction in the legal sense because they were not tenants, but which was clear and documented and left nothing to interpretation. We set a date. January 15th. I held that date inside me like a small, steady flame. In the meantime I continued. I sang in the choir. I tended my herb garden. I made soup on Sundays, the big pot of chicken and vegetables that Raymond had loved, that still felt like the most honest thing I knew how to make. I was kind to Daniel and Melissa because I am a woman who is kind, and because their not knowing what was coming was their circumstance, not my cruelty. But I watched the cameras. On the 7th of December I watched Melissa spend 45 minutes in the garage. The camera caught her moving slowly along the shelves, examining things, pausing at Raymond's work table, opening one of the lower cabinet doors and looking inside. She did not touch the filing cabinet. I had added a combination lock to it in late October, a small brass one that I was certain she had noticed and said nothing about. She stood in front of it for a moment, her hand resting briefly on the top drawer handle, and then she moved on. I saved that clip. Added it to the document. When she came back inside she poured a glass of water at the sink and I was sitting at the kitchen table with my reading glasses on, going through a seed catalog for next spring, and she looked at me with that bright practiced smile. "Anything interesting out there?" I asked without looking up from the catalog. "Was. Small but real. Just looking for the extra extension cords," she said. "For the Christmas lights." "I'll find them for you," I said. "I know exactly where everything is in this house." I turned a page in the catalog. "I always have," I added quietly, almost to myself. She didn't answer. I heard her set the glass down and leave the kitchen, and I sat alone in the afternoon light and I circled a picture of rosemary seedlings with my pen, and I felt, beneath the sadness and beneath the exhaustion, the firm and unshakable ground of a woman who knows every corner of the life she has built. Linda arrived on the 22nd of December with Greg and the children on a direct flight from Phoenix, And when I opened the front door and saw her standing on my porch with her carry-on bag and her tired travel eyes and her face that looks so much like Raymond's it sometimes stops my breath, I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized had been clenched for months. She hugged me the way Linda hugs. Completely, both arms, her chin on my shoulder, holding on a beat longer than most people do. I closed my eyes and let myself be held for just that moment. Avery and Cole tumbled past us into the house with a magnificent self-absorption of children aged 9 and 11, immediately loud and immediately hungry. And Greg shook my hand warmly and carried 3 bags inside without being asked. And the house filled up with noise and movement in a way that felt entirely different from the noise and movement of the past 9 months. Felt alive in the right way. Felt like mine. Daniel and Melissa were in the living room when they came in. The introductions were polite and surface level, everyone performing the choreography of family normalcy with varying degrees of skill. Daniel hugged Linda and she hugged him back, and I watched them from the kitchen doorway and felt the complexity of loving 2 people whose relationship with each other had always been warmer in memory than in practice. Melissa smiled at everyone with her social smile, the one I had come to recognize as the version of herself she performed for audiences. That evening after dinner, after the children were settled in the guest room I had prepared for them and Greg had fallen asleep on the pull-out sofa in the den, Linda came and sat with me in my bedroom. She sat on the edge of the bed the way she used to sit when she was a teenager and something was weighing on her, and I sat in my reading chair and we talked. I told her everything. Not just the outline I had given her on the phone, everything. The mail, the photographs in the dark, the garage, the filing cabinet, the cameras, the document, Patricia, the bank, the changes I had made, the notice that was already drafted and dated for January 15th. I told it all in order, calmly, watching her face move through a landscape of emotions she was trying to manage out of love for me. When I finished she was quiet for a long time. "Mama," she said finally. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I needed to handle it myself first," I said. "I needed to know I could." She looked at me with Raymond's eyes and I saw something shift in them, not just sadness but recognition. The recognition of a daughter seeing her mother fully, perhaps for the first time in a long time, not as someone who needs protecting but as someone who has already protected herself. "Does Daniel know?" she asked. "Not yet," I said. "He will. After Christmas." She nodded slowly. "And you're sure about the 15th? "I have never been more sure of anything since I decided to plant that herb garden," I said, and Linda laughed despite herself, a short surprised sound, and then her eyes filled and she pressed her lips together. "I should have listened more carefully," she said. "When you called me in March. I should have." "Stop," I said gently. "You said what you said. I made my own choices. That's not yours to carry." We sat together in the quiet of the room for a while. Outside I could hear the house settling into the cold night, that familiar creak and click. Somewhere down the hall I could hear the low murmur of Daniel and Melissa's television. "Can I see the footage?" Linda asked quietly. I handed her my phone and watched her watch the clip of Daniel in the dark kitchen at 2:34 in the morning. His face lit blue-white by his phone screen, photographing my mail with methodical, careful hands. I watched her watch her brother do this and I watched what it did to her face. She handed the phone back without a word. "He looks like he's done it before," she said finally. "I think he has," I said. We sat with that for a moment. Then Linda reached over and took my hand in both of hers, the way she used to hold my hand when she was small and the world felt large, and I thought of Daniel doing the same thing in church all those years ago, and I felt the full complicated sorrow of a mother who has raised 2 children and watched them become different kinds of people, and loved them both through it, and will love them both after it. "You're going to be all right, Mama," she said. "I know," I told her. And I meant it the way I always mean the things I say. Christmas morning was beautiful. Simple and warm and full of the children's noise and the smell of coffee and the sweet potato pie I made from Raymond's mother's recipe. The one I have made every year for 30 years without once writing it down because some things you carry in your hands rather than on paper. We opened gifts in the living room and the tree was lit, and the light through the windows was that particular winter gold that Memphis sometimes offers as a gift in December, thin and clear and honest. I sat in Raymond's old armchair and watched my grandchildren tear through wrapping paper, and I held my coffee cup in both hands and I let myself feel, completely and without apology, the fullness of what I had built and what I had kept and what no one was going to take from me. The days between Christmas and the New Year have always felt to me like a corridor, a quiet, unhurried passage between what has been and what is coming. The children are fed and content, the house is warm, the pressure of the holiday itself has released, and what remains is something softer. I've always loved those days. That year I loved them with a particular intensity, because I understood they were the last days of something. Linda and Greg and the children stayed through the 28th. Those mornings were the best mornings I had spent in that house in a long time. Avery and Cole at the kitchen table with their cereal and their loud opinions about everything, Greg reading the news on his tablet and occasionally sharing something aloud that nobody had asked to hear but that everyone listened to anyway, Linda beside me at the counter helping me prep for whatever I was making. The two of us moving around each other in the easy, wordless coordination of a mother and daughter who have cooked together for decades. Daniel joined us for most of those breakfasts. He was good with the children. That has always been true about him, and I held on to it as a true thing. He made Cole laugh until the boy nearly fell off his chair on the morning of the 26th, doing an impression of someone neither of them would tell me about. And I watched Daniel's face in that moment, open and easy and young, looking the way it used to look, and I felt the grief of it move through me cleanly. The way grief moves when you have already made your peace with it. Melissa was pleasant and contained, the way she was always pleasant and contained around an audience. She helped clear the table. She admired Linda's earrings. She asked Greg thoughtful questions about his work. She was performing, and I watched the performance with the calm detachment of a woman who had been watching carefully for months and no longer needed to wonder what was underneath it. On the evening of the 27th, after the children were in bed and Greg had stepped outside to call his brother, Daniel and Linda and Melissa and I sat in the living room together. Someone had put Christmas music on low, one of those instrumental jazz holiday albums Raymond had loved, and the tree lights were on and the room looked the way rooms look in the version of family life that gets put on greeting cards. Daniel was relaxed. More relaxed than I had seen him in months, loosened by the holiday and the company. And he talked more than usual, reminiscing about Christmases when he and Linda were children, the stories that families tell themselves about themselves. Linda listened and laughed in the right places, and I listened and smiled, and I was present and warm and entirely myself. And none of what was coming showed on my face at all. At one point Daniel looked at me with an expression I can only describe as tender and said, "Mama, I just want you to know, Melissa and I are really grateful for everything you've done for us this year. Having this place to land, it's meant everything." I looked at my son. "You're welcome," I said. And I meant it. Even then, knowing everything I knew, I meant it. Because I had opened my home willingly, and the gratitude was not nothing, even if it had arrived too late and with complicated hands. Melissa nodded beside him with her eyes slightly bright. And I wondered whether the emotion was real and decided it didn't matter. Some things are too far along to be changed by sincerity. Linda caught my eye across the room for just a fraction of a second. I gave her the smallest nod. She looked back at the tree. The 28th came and Linda packed and the children said loud and genuine goodbyes, and Cole asked if he could come back in the summer, and I told him absolutely. Yes, the guest room would always be ready for him. I stood on the porch and watched Greg load the rental car, and Linda came and stood beside me, and we looked at the street together the way we sometimes look at things. Side by side, not at each other. "Call me," she said quietly. "Every step," I said. She squeezed my hand and got in the car, and I watched them pull away and stood on the porch in the December cold until the car turned the corner and was gone. Then I went inside. January arrived the way January always arrives in Memphis. Gray and deliberate, the city stripped of its holiday decoration and returned to its plain working self. I found January honest in a way I appreciated. No performance required. Just the year beginning. On the 8th of January, I asked Daniel if we could sit down together after dinner. Just the two of us. He said of course, and I saw a brief uncertainty cross his face that he quickly smoothed over, and I thought, he knows. Some part of him has always known. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had told me he needed a place to land. The same table where I had said of course, this is your home too. The overhead light was warm and the house was quiet, and I folded my hands on the table and looked at my son. I told him calmly and completely. Not everything, not the cameras, not the footage, not the 2:34 in the morning. Not yet. But I told him that the arrangement needed to end. That I had given it deep thought and that January 15th was the date I was asking them to make other plans. That I had spoken with Patricia and everything had been handled properly and fairly. And that I was prepared to help with a security deposit on a new place if they needed it. I watched his face while I spoke. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. Is this because of something we did? He asked. I looked at him steadily. It's because of what I need, I said. This is my home, Daniel. I need it back. He didn't argue. That was the thing I had not fully anticipated. That after all of it, after everything I had seen and documented and quietly prepared for, Daniel simply sat across from me at that kitchen table and did not argue. He looked at his hands for a long moment and then he looked at me and there was something in his face that I recognized, something underneath the discomfort and the surprise, something that looked almost like relief. As though some part of him had known this conversation was coming and had been tired of waiting for it. Okay, Mama, he said quietly. Those two words held more in them than anything else he could have said. Melissa took it differently. She came to find me the following morning while Daniel was out, and she sat down at the kitchen table with a particular posture of a woman who has prepared what she intends to say. She was controlled and polite and she talked about how unexpected this was, about how they had been counting on more time, about how the housing market in Memphis was difficult right now. She said all of this in the measured tone of someone presenting a case, and I listened to all of it with my hands folded and my face open, and when she finished I said, gently and without any edge at all, that I understood it was difficult news and that my decision was final. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I had not seen from her before. Not the bright social smile, not the performance. Something plainer. Something that might, in different circumstances, have been the beginning of honesty. Then she nodded and left the room. They began packing on the 11th. I gave them their privacy in it, stayed out of their way, made myself available if they needed anything, kept the house running the way I always kept the house running. I cooked. I did my laundry. I went to choir practice on Wednesday evening and sang the way I always sang, with my whole chest, the way my mother taught me, because music is one of the things that has never failed me. On the 14th, the evening before they left, Daniel knocked on my bedroom door after dinner. I was in my reading chair with a book, and I told him to come in, and he stood in the doorway the way he used to stand in doorways as a teenager, one shoulder against the frame, uncertain of his welcome. Can I sit for a minute? He asked. Of course, I said. He sat on the edge of the bed, and for a while neither of us said anything. The lamp was on, and outside the window the January night was dark and still, and the radiator clicked softly in the corner. I know I haven't been what I should have been, he said finally. This year. To you. I looked at my son. I thought about every version of him I had ever known. The 7-year-old at the oven glass, the teenager in the doorway, the man who had driven 4 hours in the rain to hold me when his father died, and this man, this complicated and imperfect and still deeply loved man sitting on the edge of my bed in the lamplight. I know, I said. I'm sorry, Mama. I let that sit for a moment, the way an apology deserves to sit before you respond to it. I accept that, I said. And I love you. Those two things are both true at the same time. He looked at me with his father's eyes and I saw him absorb that, and I hoped it settled in him somewhere real, somewhere that might eventually change something. Could not know. That was his work to do, not mine. He left early the next morning. They both did. A rental truck, a few carloads. Daniel hugged me at the front door and held on a moment longer than usual, and I patted his back the way I have patted his back since he was small, steady and warm. Melissa said goodbye with more genuine feeling than I expected, and I wished her well and meant it, because I am not a woman who withholds kindness from people who are simply leaving. I stood on the porch and watched the truck turn out of the driveway and move down Cloverfield Lane and disappear. Then I went inside and I closed the door behind me. I stood in the front hallway of my house and I was quiet for a moment, and I let the silence settle around me like something I had been waiting to put back on. My house. 33 years of my life in these walls. Raymond's memory in every room. My herb garden along the south wall. My kitchen with my utensil holder in the center of the counter where it belongs. I walked to the kitchen and I moved Melissa's hand soap from beside the sink and I put my own back in its place. Such a small thing. Such a complete thing. I called Linda that afternoon and she answered before the second ring. "They're gone," I said. Pause and then a long exhale. "How are you, Mama?" I looked around my kitchen, at the winter light coming through the window above the sink, at the herb pots on the sill, at the fruit bowl on the counter beside the stack of my own mail, undisturbed and exactly where I had left it. "I'm home," I said. And that was the truest thing I had said in a very long time. That evening I made a peach cobbler. Out of season peaches, not very good ones. The same kind I had bought that October afternoon when everything was still becoming clear. I made it anyway because the ritual of it mattered more than the perfection of it, because some things you do not for the result but for the doing of them, for the continuity of being yourself across all the seasons of your life. I sat in Raymond's armchair while it baked and I watched the winter dark settle over my yard and I felt, moving through me slowly and completely, something I can only describe as peace. Not the peace of someone who has won something. Not the peace of someone who has escaped something. The peace of a woman who looked clearly at her own life, protected what she had built, and found herself still standing in the middle of it. Unhurried, undimmed, entirely herself. The cobbler bubbled golden at the edges when I took it out of the oven. I stood at the counter and I looked at it for a moment and I smiled. Then I called Linda back and told her to bring the children in the summer.